We have a long history of being home to Puerto Rican and Latino families who chose to start their lives in our state. They grew our economy, and every single day, their presence in our states and our country make us stronger and better.
That was Governor Tim Walz yesterday in Pennsylvania. With just 44 days until the election, the Harris-Walz campaign is aggressively reaching out to Latino voters. They kicked off Hispanic Heritage Month with a historic $3 million investment in Spanish-language radio ads. And they are deploying prominent Latino leaders to cultural events within communities around the country. One of those leaders joins us now, Democratic Senator Ben Ray Lujan of New Mexico. Welcome, sir.
Senador, good morning to you. How fun to have you with us. You know, it is telling to me watching that video, Puerto Ricans are Americans, right? So they're not immigrants to this country. Many of your constituents in New Mexico, third, fourth, fifth generation Hispanics. And yet I think it is important for voters across this country to understand what it is that Donald Trump is promising vis-a-vis immigration in a second term. I want you to take a listen to something that Vice President Harris had to say about Donald Trump's deportation plans. This is at the CHC.
Donald Trump and his extremist allies will keep trying to pull us backward. We all remember what they did to tear families apart. And now they have pledged to carry out the largest deportation, a mass deportation in American history. Imagine what that would look like and what that would be. How's that going to happen? Massive raids? Massive detention camps? What are they talking about?
What are they talking about, Senator? Because when pushed on it, Donald Trump doesn't actually seem to know how to articulate this vision that is laid out in Project 2025.
Well, Alicia, good morning. Good to be with you, Simone and Michael, this morning. Look, I'm very worried about the impact to my Latino brothers and sisters all across America, including citizens of America, because they're going to be profiled. And when you have people like Stephen Miller and the ugly policies and those that President Trump decided to surround himself with, there's no question that there's going to be mass deportations if Donald Trump is reelected, and how he's going to round people up. It is terrifying. Going to schools, going to church, coming out of church, places where we should feel the safest is where Donald Trump and folks like Stephen Miller are going to target them. I am terrified to the treatment of people under the former president. That's just one reason why he should not be reelected at all, and why we need to stand together and make sure that we elect Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Tim Walz to be President of the United States and Vice President of the United States of America.
You know, it's interesting where we are now and how this journey began. With Hispanic voters and the Democratic Party. I think there was a lot of conversation about that vote, very much like the African-American vote, being taken for granted, assumed by the Biden team at the time. And the numbers then were not very favorable. Donald Trump in his campaign were making inroads by leveling up fake sneakers and menthol cigarettes and deploying all kinds of tricks and gimmicks to sort of capture the imagination. But now we're looking at polling of likely Hispanic voters from the New York Times, Siena College, showing a 55-41% edge for Kamala Harris's campaign. Talk about that shift in the attitude, because I suspect it's a little bit more than, oh, we just replaced, switched out the top of the ticket. Is the messaging from the campaign resonating on the economy, on the job creation, appealing to that true, purely entrepreneurial spirit of the Hispanic community? How does that? How do you account for that change that we're seeing now in the numbers?
Well, Michael, you know the importance of reaching out to communities, to our Black brothers and sisters, our brown brothers and sisters, Native American communities throughout the country. I saw you do it, and you were good.
You're a little too good.
A little too good. But what's important is that there's conversations from the beginning, not after voting begins, not after early voting begins, and making sure you connect. Number one, the Harris campaign and the Walz campaign are reaching out to communities, not just on television, on radio, with social media ads, but they're showing up in communities and having conversations. Surrogates as well are prioritizing Latino communities throughout the United States. Think Pennsylvania, Arizona, Nevada, where I've been, and I've seen it firsthand, number one. Number two, the shift in energy. Latino voters are a very young cohort.
Yeah.
And so I'm seeing a lot of energy from younger voters throughout America, especially with Latino voters as well. So when the Harris campaign is putting real money, and Julie Rodriguez is doing incredible work, but in English and Spanish, and the way that I grew up, Michael, in Spanglish, where you use English and Spanish together. Alicia, I know you connect with that as well. But that's how I grew up, talking to my parents and my grandparents, and it was both languages that were used together beautifully. It was like a little poem. But connecting with voters and understanding they're not monolithic. You're speaking to voters with the voices and the Spanish that is theirs, that's from their community, and the heroes in each one of those communities that is rising up to share their own stories. That's where I see this energy coming from. And while those numbers are improving, they're only getting better.
I think that's so important, an important point. Speaking, meeting people where they are, as I like to say, where they are, how they are, going to places where the people read, watch, and listen to, and talking about the issues that they care about. Like, to be very clear, UNIDOS, this is from a survey in early August, ranking the top 6 issues that elected officials should address that are important to Latino voters, Latino Hispanic voters. This is what that said: inflation, rising cost of living, jobs in the economy, the lack of affordable housing, healthcare, immigration and border security was number 5, crime and gun violence number 6. Oh, the Latino community, just like Black people, just like young people, they care about the economy.
Right. Amen.
Who would have thunk it? And it seems to me that the Harris campaign is doing a very good job of speaking to the issues that they know voters are concerned about, while also warning them of the dangers of what Donald Trump is talking about. I mean, the denaturalization, deportation, like, he is coming for people who are Americans. And they will have a legal way to do it. And if it isn't legal, it doesn't matter, because the Supreme Court done said he can do whatever he wants. CC, Supreme Court decision. So this is a two-pronged approach, it seems like.
Amen, is what I can say to that. Look, around our kitchen table, and we're a family where the lines moved on us, right? New Mexico once being Old Mexico, parts of the Southwest as well. So whether you're in the United States multi-generationally, or you're here in your first generation as well with your family, we all have family, parents, grandparents, kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews. I can tell you, like in the Black community, Samoa, family is everything. And when you get together for a family gathering, it's first cousins, second cousins, third cousins, those cousins that you think that are cousins, but you're not quite sure, but you're going to make sure you connect with them.
Yes.
But it's the conversations around that kitchen table. What's happening to keep a roof over your head? Where's that next job opportunity going to come from? I and Raphael Warnock are the only 2 U.S. senators that went to Head Start. What's going to be available for your children to be able to go to Head Start or child care? That all matters. And we also care about the treatment of our brothers and sisters as well. That's what the Bible teaches me. When I go to church on Sundays, that's what I hear from my priest. It makes a big difference. Those are democratic issues. The teachings of St. Francis, helping those that need a bite to eat, helping to clothe those that need a little bit of help as well, providing shelter to all of us. That's an American issue. And so I appreciate where the Harris campaign is leading. And we talk about home ownership. We talk about the bills that are hitting us every month and what Democrats are going to do to make sure that we're lowering costs for the American people and we're helping to make home ownership a reality. And we're also lowering rent as well. I very much appreciate what not just yet, but Vice President Harris is saying about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. She's laying out a clear plan.
A clear plan. Senator Ben Ray Lujan, thank you very much for being with us today.
Ken, a warm welcome back to you to the show, and it's great to see you again, and congratulations on receiving the Liberty Medal.
Thank you, Ali. It's great to be with you.
You have spent a lot of time studying, and you and I have had some conversations thinking about some of this country's most tumultuous periods in history. You talk a lot about how it was more tumultuous during the Civil War. It was as tumultuous during the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War. I don't know whether it's worth any more the comparisons, but how are you thinking about the current moment as it relates to some of the worst moments we've faced in this country?
there seems something incredibly unprecedented about what's going on right now. The other times that you cited, and you can go back even further to our revolutionary period. I'm now in the process of finishing up a big series on the history of the American Revolution that will be out next year. You see civil war happening at our beloved revolution. Our own Civil War was a sectional war. But the peaceful transfer of power, the free and fair elections, the independence of the judiciary didn't seem in doubt. However, I think those of us who are historians and amateur historians, storytellers about the past, there's a kind of optimism that attends. You see a great faith. Lincoln was not supposed to be reelected in 1864 and was. The United States Army that he was the commander-in-chief of was not supposed to vote for him, and they did. And so I think what you have are very similar echoes, rhymes, Mark Twain would say, between these periods. But of course, each moment, as Lincoln pointed out, is unique to the present. And as he pointed out in a speech to Congress, the dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. As our case is new, we must think anew, we must act anew, and then we can save our country. And so I think we can do a lot of historical speculation, a lot of parlor games about what ifs, but at the same time, we're dealt a certain hand of cards right now, which we have to respond to.
So let's talk about the various ways, we won't get through many of them, but the ways in which one can respond to it in the moment. At an event in Wisconsin on Friday, Liz Cheney, who is a very conservative Republican, suggested that a new political party might be needed going forward. She said, quote, "There is certainly going to be a big shift, I think, in how our politics work. I don't know exactly what that will look like. I don't think it will simply be the Republican Party is going to put up a new slate of candidates and off to the races. I think far too much has happened that's too damaging." When the Republican Party was formed in the 1850s, these are my words, by the way, it was a coalition of people who formerly belonged to other parties. So let's think about this. There may be some lesson in the realignment of politics and political parties in America, as opposed to the changing of the Electoral College, which is a truly hard thing to do.
Yeah, I think it's true. And while I'm not sure, I think there is so much entrenched and ingrained about the two parties that it's going to be difficult for the Republican Party to figure out a way to escape the specific gravity of the darkness that now engulfs it. I mean, this is a party, as you pointed out, Allie, born in the 1850s in a schoolhouse in Ripon, Wisconsin. They had one thing they were going to do out of the ashes of the Whig Party and other disaffected people who were gravitating to something new, is that they wanted the emancipation, they wanted the end of slavery in the United States. And that Republican Party has now morphed into some incredibly dangerous, almost resembling the know-nothings of that period that are racist and certainly anti-immigrant and sort of Abraham Lincoln is turning over in his grave that this still has the label of the Republican Party. And so I think we've got to count on Liz Cheney being right in a long term, that there's going to be some reconfiguration, that we are going to leave at least the MAGA base behind and hope that our country is able to create a kind of opposition that has the kind of values before. Remember, the great legislation in the 20th century involved not only Democratic but Republican votes, whether it's voting rights or civil rights or Medicare or Medicaid, even going back to Social Security. The Republican Party was always, from the beginning of the 20th century, an engine of progressivism as much, if not more, than the Democratic Party. And states like Wisconsin were laboratories of experimentation in social ideas that would make government more responsive, level the playing field. Theodore Roosevelt is, of course, a perfect example of that kind of progressive in the White House. And so you can hope, in my office, I have a poster of the intertwining, snaking, paths that both parties have taken. One of the things that I think was beneficial to the Democratic Party, as much as it has challenged it since the Civil Rights Acts of the mid-1960s, is that it has lost those people who are uninterested in following Jefferson's words, though he himself had some contradictions, obviously, that all men are created equal. All men and all people are created equal. And so I think there's a wonderful new coalition that is coalescing. And if you just step back and think about the odd couple of not just Liz Cheney, but her dad, crusty old, Dick Cheney and Bernie Sanders are voting for the same person. Bernie ought to be pulling a lot of those blue collar votes. And of course, it's hard to ignore Dick Cheney. He is not a rhino. He is not anything but a rock ribbed conservative. And all of them and his daughter believe that the grave danger is another term of Donald Trump.
In 2026, America is going to celebrate its 250th birthday. Ahead of that, you'll be releasing a new documentary you were just mentioning about the American Revolution. You're going right back to the start. Tell me why you chose that as the subject of this film as America is approaching this milestone.
It was interesting, Ali, when the ink was not dry on the Vietnam film, we were still in the process of locking it when I said, we're going to do the revolution. And it wasn't with the eye towards the 250th anniversary. I did worry that in 2026 we might be sort of consumed by a kind of sentimental nostalgia, treacly fife and drum stuff, and that what was good is that the American Revolution started in 1775, so the 250th would come a year before for the actual beginning of the revolution, and that we could get to understand this period that we sort of protected. We accept the violence of the Civil War and World War II in Vietnam and the First World War, but we sort of think of the revolution as these guys thinking great ideas, and it is about that. But it's also an incredibly bloody civil war. And so I think it was the ability to try to dig deep and understand the complexities of it. We live in a modern media culture, no insult intended, Ali, in which everything is dialectically preoccupied. That is to say, it's red state or blue state, it's MSNBC or it's Fox. And I think that when you call balls and strikes, as we've tried to do in our films, you begin to realize that everybody has feet of clay. George Washington certainly does. And so there's no kind of perfect thing. You're not trying to attend to it. The patriotism, which is so important for Americans to have, is not just the last refuge of scoundrels, but a very complex self-examination. Judge Learned Hand said, liberty is never being too sure you're right. Could there be a better name for a judge than Learned Hand? And could there be anything better than that comment? Certainty is the enemy of everything. When we are certain about stuff, we've forgotten to understand that sometimes the opposite may also be true. So we have to tell a true, honest, complicated past that's unafraid of controversy and tragedy, but equally drawn to those stories and moments that suggest an abiding faith in the human spirit, and particularly the unique role this remarkable republic plays in the positive progress of mankind.
Well, that's interesting because when you were selected to be the recipient of this year's Liberty Medal, you remarked, quote, "There's nothing more important in a democracy than educating the public about its history." Now, on this show, we have been following the attacks on our country's education system, which often involves the banning of books and the disputes over curricula about our history in the past and our modern history. Are you concerned about that growing as a political pressure point in recent years? The idea of our history and how we teach it has itself come under attack.
Yeah, it's been politicized in such unfortunate ways. And of course, anybody is concerned about it. Listen, I can report back from the late 18th century that I know categorically what the founders meant by the pursuit of happiness. It isn't the pursuit of objects in a marketplace of things. It's lifelong learning in a marketplace of ideas. They felt if we were going to create this new thing, everybody heretofore had been a subject. If we're going to create these new entities, citizens. They had to lead a virtuous life. And to be virtuous was to constantly educate yourself. That's what it was about. And implicit in that was a kind of honest evaluation, not only of what has happened, what we know in science as well as arts and humanities, but what we don't know, where we fail, where we come up short. And so what you begin to see is that our experiment is all about future words. We're in pursuit of happiness, in a more perfect union. Mm-hmm. We are a nation in the process of becoming. And unfortunately, what happens is when we gravitate to the certainty, we say, we don't need to teach this. Slavery is not that bad. We don't want to upset kids who are already participating in video games, being yelled at by coaches, being talked about damnation by pastors, being, engaged in a world in which they're as smart as the politicians who are trying to sort of slide us into some arbitrary, almost Soviet kind of thing in which all of a sudden somebody's picture disappears from the Politburo and they never existed. Yep. We can't do that. We were slave owners. We were born in slavery. The guy who said all men are created equal owned hundreds of human beings and didn't see the contradiction. If you do not own that, you do not have the possibility to escape the specific gravity of the negative things that have attended our history throughout. And our work is, and in this moment, no more important than it's ever been, is to escape the gravity of those things, to not go back, but to go forward, to quote a person in the news, turn the page.
But more concerning, perhaps, is that Trump often thinks he's making sense when he's clearly not. Remember a few weeks ago when he was asked about the cost of childcare? Pretty simple question. His response, though, was a rambling word salad about tariffs, which literally had nothing to do with the topic at hand. And all this happens a lot. When he was asked just on Tuesday how he would bring down the cost of groceries, again, in a simple question, Trump went on an 8-minute non sequitur, swerving from energy prices to interest rates to farm subsidies to windmills to a border wall with Mexico. And even the excuses he makes about his rambling and incoherence are themselves rambling and incoherent.
But I do have to say, so I give these long, sometimes very complex sentences and paragraphs, but they all come together. I do it a lot. They say, it's terrible. So they say, so I'll give this long, complex area, for instance, that I talked about a lot of different territory.
Yeah, I have no idea what he was saying there either. I mean, the thing is, Trump is completely lacking in self-awareness because his enablers have always turned a blind eye to his failings. That's been true ever since he was a kid. As Mary Trump points out in her new book, quote, Donald had none of the requisite skills to succeed on his own. But she writes, quote, his willingness to do anything to fit within his father's mold made him the recipient of tens of millions of dollars to maintain the illusion of brilliance that never existed. Joining me now for the first time on this show is Mary Trump, whose new book is titled Who Could Ever Love You? A Family Memoir. Mary, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining me. And this is it's a more personal book, or that's how I read it, than the first one you wrote in 2020. But you still share some disturbing insight into your uncle. I mean, one of the things that stuck out to me that I kind of just mentioned there was how you talk about how Donald Trump's father, your grandfather, indulged his delusions and essentially glossed over his very obvious failings. I mean, that sounds to me like what the Republican Party has been doing for more than 8 years now. Talk to me a little bit about this illusion of brilliance, a phrase, which is a great phrase, and what you mean by that.
First of all, Jen, it's so great to be with you. I really appreciate your having me on. And yeah, this book is different from the first one, which I consider a psychological history of a family. This one is very much a memoir. And there is some focus on Donald because he and I grew up, although in different generations, in the same family. And I had the great misfortune of sort of watching how all of that unfolded, how it affected my dad and therefore me. I think the fundamental problem was that my father, Fred Jr., was the oldest son and namesake who was expected to take over the family business. My grandfather, and I'm saying this term diagnostically, was a sociopath who saw other people as tools. And when he found my father wanting for various very complicated reasons, he turned to his next oldest son, Donald, who had no skills, no requisite skills to be an entrepreneur or to expand the business the way my grandfather intended. However, he did have a bunch of defense mechanisms that he had used to protect himself from his, quite frankly, bleak early years on the planet, that my grandfather found very useful. Donald's bullying, his grandiose sense of himself. And as we've seen, Donald and my grandfather, with the help of New York media and the banks and eventually the Republican Party, really did leverage those things to Donald's benefit, and I should say to the disadvantage of the rest of us.
It's so interesting how you describe it. I mean, this is what we're seeing today, as I mentioned, or that's how I see it. I mean, you've observed your uncle for more than 50 years, for better or worse, and I know it's been worse at many times. I was just talking about, and I'm not the only one who's observed this, I mean, he seems to be really struggling lately to answer straightforward questions about the cost of childcare, housing, groceries. His answers don't really make sense. I mean, is that just par for the course for decades, or have you noticed a change in his ability to articulate?
Yeah, well, first of all, as a human being, Donald is as bad as he's always been. This is somebody who's never evolved. This is somebody who seems worse behaviorally simply because he's being given more opportunities to be worse. But in terms of his functioning on a cognitive level, absolutely there's been deterioration. I mean, Donald is somebody who has had severe psychiatric disorders for decades that have remained untreated, and any illness you have that you don't treat will worsen. And I think he's being pushed further and further because of Vice President Harris's success, because of his own failures, into a world that is more delusional. When he talks about how enthusiastic the crowd at the debate was, he's probably talking about himself. He was his audience for that debate in many, many ways. So I hope that more media outlets allow us to hear what Donald's actually saying instead of taking it upon themselves to, quote unquote, translate him. His nonsense is untranslatable. So what ends up happening, because human beings need to make meaning of things, is that certain reporters and journalists end up imbuing Donald's meaningless statements with meaning, so they don't seem as dangerous and, quite frankly, unhinged as they really are.
It's the sane washing of all of it, which is so interesting. The audience of him is I didn't think of it that way, but makes a lot of sense. I wanted to play for you to this point. I mean, he seemed surprised, this week, Trump, that a woman could be doing better than him on the stage, better than a man. So I want to play something he had to say and get your thoughts on it. There are a few people who know how to know what he's thinking than you. So let's play that.
They put her in, and she somehow, a woman, somehow she's doing better than he did.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine it can last.
Somehow a woman. I mean, this is kind of one of those things where he's refusing to do this debate so far. The next one, he seems surprised she wiped the floor with him at the debate. Is it a gender thing? What is that about?
Well, we are a family of misogynists. Even many of the women in my family were misogynists. So it is not at all surprising how clearly his contempt for women comes through, specifically when he's speaking about Vice President Harris. We've also seen how he speaks about women in general, the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But part of this, too, is just Donald once again failing the cognitive test. He just cannot exist in a world where he isn't always the winner. Recognizing himself as a loser is almost impossible. Being a loser was absolutely the worst thing you could be in my family. I mean, it was lethal to be a loser in my family. So he's still suffering from the narcissistic injury Vice President Harris inflicted on him at the first debate, which will be the only debate because Donald will never, ever allow himself to be in that kind of vulnerable position again.
Election Day is 45 days away, but early voting has already started in several states, with Maryland, New Jersey, and Oklahoma joining the list today. It'll get underway in Georgia in less than 3 weeks. But that state's MAGA-controlled election board, a creature of the voter suppression law enacted by the Republican-controlled state government after President Biden won the state in 2020, is doing everything it can to gum up the works even after votes have been cast in the Peach State. Under a new rule passed yesterday, all of Georgia's votes cast on Election Day will now have to be hand-counted. How bad is this decision? So bad that both Georgia's Republican Attorney General and Republican Secretary of State have slammed it. And voting rights advocates are warning that Georgia could end up missing the December 25th deadline for electoral votes to be received by the president of the Senate and the archivist. Certification of those results will be January 6th. As Ari Berman writes in Mother Jones, quote, even if the election results are ultimately certified, any kind of dispute or delay in counting votes could be weaponized by Trump and his allies to disastrous effect. Joining me now, Ari Berman, national voting rights correspondent for Mother Jones. He's the author of Minority Rule, the right-wing attack on the will of the people and the fight to resist it. Ari, thank you very much for coming to the Saturday show. So walk us through how could delaying the results in Georgia hand the presidency to Trump?
Well, hey, Jonathan, great to see you again. So what would happen is that Georgia would not certify its electoral college votes in time. No candidate would get a majority in the electoral college as a result. And that would then throw the election to the House of Representatives, which has not happened since 1824. And then what would happen is the House would vote, but it wouldn't be a majority of members of the House voting. It would be a majority of state delegations where Republicans would have an advantage. And that's really the nightmare scenario here is you could have a presidential candidate who loses the popular vote, who does not win a majority of the Electoral College, but who could then be selected by House Republicans who don't even represent a majority of that body. And it might be a far-fetched scenario, but under the Constitution, it is a possible one.
Right. It is a possible one. If I learned anything after 4 years of Donald Trump in the White House is if you can imagine it, it could possibly happen. So everyone needs to keep their imaginations open and broad. You know, the Georgia Attorney General and Secretary of State say they don't think the election board's decision can stand up to legal challenge. What do you make of that? Could this be over? Could this decision, but also a raft of their other decisions, be overturned?
Yes, I think it could very likely be blocked in Georgia law because listen, when the Republican Secretary of State weighs in ahead of time against these kind of claims, you know how serious it is. There have been a series of changes passed by the MAGA Georgia State Board of Election now, not just hand counting ballots, but saying that counties can undertake a reasonable inquiry before certifying elections without specifying what that inquiry is, allowing them access to all election related documentation. And it feels like Georgia Republicans are laying the groundwork not to certify the election if a Democrat wins and trying to make certification optional as opposed to mandatory. So they're really redefining what Georgia law requires. And I think that's going to put them in a difficult position with the courts. But what Trump is trying to do is just create chaos and uncertainty here so he can weaponize it, just like he tried to weaponize any kind of delay in counting the ballots or any kind of process that takes a little bit longer in counting the ballots in 2020. Ironically, the new hand counting rule is going to do exactly that. It's going to make it longer to count ballots, and then Trump's going to turn around and say, hey, there's something wrong because it's taking longer to count ballots, even though his side pushed for those rules.
Let me get you on one more thing before we have to let you go in 30 seconds. Nebraska. And Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina going to Nebraska and at the urging also of Donald Trump, calling on Nebraska to go to a winner-take-all format for its electoral votes, because in Nebraska there's that one district where the electoral vote can go another way. Real quickly, Tell us why what they're trying to do is equally important to pay attention to.
Well, it's so concerning because if that one Nebraska vote goes to Trump instead, the election could be tied 269 to 269 if Harris wins those blue wall states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. That could also throw the election to the House. So the Electoral College already systematically benefits Republicans, and now they're trying to rig it further for the GOP. And this is just yet another example of them trying to rig the rules at the 11th hour and upend Democratic norms when it feels like their side's not winning fair and square.
Ari Berman, you are the expert, so I thank you very much, as always, for bringing your expertise to the Saturday Show. Thank you.
Great to see you again, Jonathan. Thank you.
Joining me now, Democratic Congressman from Massachusetts, Seth Moulton. Welcome to you, Congressman. So you just heard from a couple of Trump voters there on the debate. Do Americans need to witness another Harris-Trump face-off, or is Donald Trump right? It's just too late now that early voting has begun in some states.
Donald Trump is clearly very scared. But it would be helpful. Yes. I mean, this is a very short campaign. And so we ought to be able to hear the two candidates, face off and debate their proposals, or in Trump's case, the lack thereof. And for Americans to really get another chance to see the contrast between these two people running for the highest office in the land. Absolutely, we should have another debate.
Yeah. And look, by the way, 2020, that last debate, that was October 22nd. This is supposed to be October 23rd. So maybe your point is well taken. He's running scared on this one. What about the new poll?
He's obviously scared. I mean, he got creamed. He got crushed. He got obliterated in that first debate. And as much as he goes around and tries to tell people that he actually won, we all know he's full of, he's not going to want, he doesn't want to debate again. His team is scared of it. He's scared of it. He's trying to get out of it. I hope Harris holds his feet to the fire.
Okay, we'll see if she does. Meantime, checking out the new NBC News poll, which shows Kamala Harris with a 5-point lead over Donald Trump within the margin of error. But Trump does hold advantages on the economy, inflation, the border. They are considered the top issues for voters overall. So with just 6 weeks left in this election, how might Harris change minds on those issues?
What I want to see the vice president do is actually separate herself a little bit from President Biden. I mean, she's been an amazing teammate to the president. I love President Biden myself, but we all know that a lot of Americans have problems with his immigration policy, for example. In fact, he himself has made several changes to his immigration policy over the course of his term. The Republicans are trying to tie Harris to Biden. If you look at Fox News, it's always the Biden-Harris plan, the Biden-Harris problem now, whereas just a few months ago, of course, it just said Biden. Everyone in the Republican Party, all their supporters are trying to blame her for his problems. Why doesn't she just say, you know what, I would do things a little bit differently. Here's how I would handle things differently than the president. I love the president. I respect him, but I would have handled these tough issues in a different way. Here's how I would lead. I think that would be incredibly powerful for her to say. And I don't think it would turn off Democrats. I think that we all know that she's an independent woman. She's an independent leader. She's a strong leader, and she should show some of those differences with Biden.
She's a different person. She'll be a different leader. I mean,
That's right.
Makes sense. What about the NBC News poll that shows that 33-point gender gap between the two candidates? Harris leads women by 21 points. Trump is up among men by 12. Why do you think there's such a significant gap? And is there something Harris can do to bring some of those guys into her camp?
Well, I think that, again, the more she gets out there and shows that she will lead on these key issues that male voters care about a lot, including immigration and the economy, that she can separate herself not just from Donald Trump, but from President Biden on some of these key issues, I think she'll win more of these people over. I've never really understood why so many men like someone like Donald Trump, who's such a fundamentally squirmy, weak person himself. I mean, he is not a model of manhood, a very far stretch from it. So she has the ability to win these voters over, but I think they're hung up on some of these key issues. And sometimes I hear people say, I don't like Trump. I know he's not a good guy, but the economy was good under him, or we didn't have as much inflation. They're not listening to the details of his new plans, which would dramatically increase inflation if Trump is elected president. But Harris needs to make that case. She needs to make it strongly. And again, I think being willing to show some separation from the president on these issues would help her.
I know you are headlining, my friend, a Harris Walls fundraiser this week for veterans, service members, military families. Is there anything tangible that Harris should do to appeal to veterans who are most dug in at this point?
No, I mean, I think veterans know that Donald Trump is terrible for veterans. He hates veterans. He doesn't understand why people serve. We've all heard all the different ways that he's assaulted vets, called us suckers and losers and everything else. But Harris needs to make an affirmative case for what she will do. The Biden administration did some great things for veterans, including passing the PACT Act over the objection of many congressional Republicans, which is getting aid to people like myself who were exposed to burn pits overseas, as just one example. But she needs to make a case for all the things she's going to do in the future. And I think veterans are also looking at foreign policy. And we need to hear a bit more from the vice president on what her foreign policy would look like in such a troubled time in the world. I think if she can get out there and make those cases, she'll win more veterans over.
You're a member of the Armed Services Committee and a Marine, so I want to get your perspective on a Wall Street Journal report saying that senior U.S. officials now say they are privately acknowledging a ceasefire and hostage deal is unlikely before President Biden's term ends. Republican Senator Tom Cotton this morning said if the administration had taken a different approach, the war could already be over. Here's part of that.
First off, they're not giving them the political and diplomatic support that they needed from the very beginning. If rather than trying to put constant pressure on Israel, more pressure than we put on Iran and its terrorist networks, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris had simply adopted policy to let Israel win and back them to the hilt, the war in Hamas probably would have ended a long time ago.
Okay. Does the administration take fault for the prolonging of the war that now seems to be at the brink of erupting into something even worse? Okay, no on that. Does Kamala Harris need to promise a different approach if Biden is not able to seal a deal before the term ends? And really, this question needs to be asked. How much about the war lies in the hands of the United States, really?
It's a great question, Alex, but let's start with the beginning. What Tom Cotton said is absurd. The idea that we're putting more pressure on Israel than Iran, with the heavy sanctions the Biden administration has applied and enforced, with taking out Iranian proxies in Iraq and elsewhere. I mean, that's just an absurd statement. And people like Tom Cotton are more interested in scoring partisan points than doing what's right to end this horrific war. And making sure, by the way, in the process that we don't have a wider war in the Middle East. That's the most important priority for the United States. Yes, we're supporting Israel. Yes, we're putting pressure on Iran and all the proxies around the Middle East that want to foment a wider war. But the worst thing that could happen for our national security is for the United States to get drawn into a wider war in the Middle East. That's why the Biden-Harris administration has been working hard to end it. It's a tricky balance. We're going to stand by Israel, but we're also going to pressure Israel to do the right thing to actually win this war and not just be vindictive against the Gazans. They're not following the lessons that we learned in Iraq and Afghanistan. It would be much more productive if veterans like Tom Cotton pointed those problems out to Israel so that they can actually win and defeat Hamas, which everyone needs for there to be peace in the Middle East. That would bring the war to a close. That would set the stage for an actual peace deal, and that would prevent the United States from getting drawn into a war in the Middle East.
Okay. Quick answer on this one. Is there going to be a government shutdown?
No, I don't think so, only because the Republicans realize it will kill them in the election and they're awful close. But they have no plan. It's pathetic. Yet again, we hurtle towards a shutdown because they're listening more closely to Donald Trump than they are to American voters.
Okay. Always good to see you, Congressman Seth Moulton. Thanks again.
Great to see you too, Alex. Take care.